Hello, I'm Irene Frieze from the University of Pittsburgh in the United States. I wish I could be there with you today. I'm sorry I can't be, but I hope that seeing this video will be a little bit helpful to you. So today I'm going to be talking about the issue of how we internationalize psychological research on gender. So when we think about gender studies and we think about internationalizing that and put that in that broader context, we need to think very seriously about what that means and what that means about replication. We tend to assume that we understand how things work, that we understand how behavior functions, and we base that on our own personal experiences, and we also we kind of tend to have theories that are based on what we've experienced, and we assume that those theories are going to work for other places and other times. But our experiences are somewhat limited. We all live in a particular environment, and we make various assumptions about that environment. And we may not be aware of some of the assumptions we're making, that we're assuming things will be the same as they are here in other places. And that, of course, can create a problem as we try to develop research hypotheses, especially since our knowledge comes not only from our own personal experiences, but from the published literature. And there we have problems. Especially in psychology, some of the major journals are in psychology in the United States. They're published in English. And there have been studies showing that much of the published research in psychology, especially in the US journals, comes from US samples. And not only is it US samples, but US educated samples are the typical pattern. And often they're examples of college students, which makes it even more limited, because those are the people that are available to us and the ones that are easiest for us to study. And this has been pointed out in the literature. For example, there's a very nice paper by Arnett, and I can send some of these references if anybody's interested, arguing that the 5% of the world population that appears in these US studies and in much of the psychological literature is really not representative of the entire population of the world. So all of these theories and ideas that we have about how we function psychologically are based on this relatively limited sample. And since these are considered often the most prestigious journals, people tend to cite these and assume that things there are true for everybody. But it's interesting when we talk about the issue of replication and how much do these ideas really replicate in other societies. And this, as you may know, has been a big topic in American psychology recently, because some of the findings that people assumed would apply in other places don't replicate. But a number of discussions of that in the literature, a big topic of discussion. How do we make things more replicable? How do we even know if they're going to replicate? And it's interesting, because this issue of replication, I would argue, may be a little misguided. So if you look at an area like behavioral genetics, now if there's anything that should replicate across humanity, it would be things based on behavioral genetics. Things that, psychological factors coming from our genes. And already, of course, we have discussions now of how much even our genetic determinants of behavior are affected by environment. So a very interesting recent study by Plowman and colleagues suggests that most, or maybe all, psychological traits show some genetic influence. So again, they should replicate. Examples where there's clear genetic contributions include IQ studies, schizophrenia, food preferences, political beliefs, altruism, all kinds of things appear to have a clear genetic component to them. But, and again, we assume that once it's genetic, it must be true of everybody. But these heritability estimates, how much is the genetic influence? Apparently IQ has one of the strongest genetic influences, estimated to be about 50% genetic. In all other variables, it tends to be less than that. Everything they've looked at and been able to find that. So number one, that means that no traits are 100% heritable. And on the other hand, even at most, the other 50% is being caused by other factors. So those other factors are probably largely based on the environment. And of course, the environment depends upon the culture. So what does all of this mean in terms of gender research? So I would argue that gender is an area that really does differ across cultures. Every society has its own idea of what the appropriate roles are for men and for women, for boys and for girls. Very, very cultural kinds of behaviors. So if we're going to understand gender and understand issues of gender, we really need to look at what's happening not just in the US, not just in a few other countries, possibly in Europe, but we need to understand from the whole world. We need studies from countries like Pakistan that will show us possibly a different perspective on some of these factors. And of course, if we're going to do that, if we're going to have these studies from other cultures, we have to acknowledge where the study is coming from and acknowledge the culture that it's embedded in and not be embarrassed about that, but publicize that, make it something important in the research. I've now read many, many dissertations from Pakistan, and I'm always amazed at how rare it is that the researchers who are providing very important data for the world don't even really talk about the fact that this is a study coming from Pakistan, embedded in Pakistani culture. We need to know that. We need to understand how that culture may be affecting what the data are. So I would argue that in terms of how we're going to internationalize things, and in gender as well as other types of psychological research, you need to specify the country of origin. You need to say where the sample is coming from. And that needs to be done in the abstract so people can search very quickly to look for different cultures, and in the text of the paper. And to make that cultural context more clear, so that other people get an idea of what that culture is like, there needs to be information about the culture built into the paper, and how does the culture deal with the particular topic of the paper. So, and this also needs to occur as we review the literature. So anytime you talk about findings from one culture or another, that needs to be explicitly noted. This was a sample based in the US. They reported such and such. Here's another sample from India. They reported such and such. If the findings are different, possibly that's because of the culture. We need to know that, and the only way we can know that is if we explicitly look at the culture in the discussion of our findings. So what does all this mean, particularly about gender research? Well, first of all, the kinds of questions we ask may differ. The important topics may be different in different cultures. So what are the important topics in your society? What are the ideas, what are the issues about gender that really need to be addressed? And I would argue that things like studies of relationship issues are very sensitive to cultural issues. Patterns of communication are highly dependent on culture. And there's, I'm sure, hundreds of other topics that are very, very highly affected by culture that need to be considered. And what else do we need to consider? We need to think about, for example, the scales that are used. Many, many times I've found in the Pakistani dissertation, some measure has been taken often from a US paper. It's been translated into Urdu. But there's not a lot of data about validity. There may be some reliability data, but how about the validity of the thing? Do the items really make sense in that cultural context? I remember one of the standard gender scales in the literature is a scale, Attitudes Towards Women scale, developed to look at gender beliefs about what men and women should do. That when I tried to translate that for a study I did in Eastern Europe, some of the items just simply didn't make any sense within their culture. Issues about divorce, issues about couples living together were treated very differently in Slovenia, where we were doing the study, than they were in the United States. So any items related to those topics didn't make sense. And I can also suggest that there were items in there of things like ironing clothes, which is something people in the United States don't do a lot of these days. So even within the US context, that item was no longer relevant to understanding what men and women were doing. So the cultural context can change over time, which makes it even more complicated. So I would argue that in order to create this international database that we so desperately need, we need to first of all, in all of our research, carefully define the sample. So what does that mean? So a cultural group has shared beliefs, norms, values, and practices and expectations. Well, the culture is not only from the country, but also within the subgroup within the country. So if it's a college student sample, that needs to be explained, and maybe even something about the university or the college and what the characteristics of the people are. If it's a community sample, what do we know about the community where the sample comes from? What particular groups are there within the community? We need to carefully define not only the overall sample, but also the specific sample there. And in trying to now make a statement about that culture and that particular sample, that particular subgroup, I would argue that unlike what is often recommended, that you clean the sample so that it's well defined. As a journal editor, this was something I always used to insist on among the publications in our journal, that if you have people within your sample that don't fit the general norms of that sample, they should be omitted from the sample, because otherwise we don't know what variation they're bringing into the data that may confuse our understanding. For example, with a college student sample, I always suggest we take out the older people. Often you get older people coming into the sample, but if we want to define our sample as a young college student sample, we don't want the older people there. And there are many other variables like this that need to be controlled. Age is one, an obvious one, but it could be other things too. It could be marital status. It depends on the sample. It depends on what the research questions are. These need to be defined to be relevant for that group. And then the sample needs to be cleaned to have a sample that is used for that particular kind of research project. I would also further suggest that all of these issues about what we put in papers, how we define the sample, how we put it in the abstract, how we put it in the text of the paper, how it guides our dealing with the data, and how we deal with our data before we analyze it, that those issues also need to be considered if you're reviewing not only your own work, but also the work of others. So if you're ever called upon to review articles that other people do, you should consider this issue and think about it very carefully. So I do want to thank you. I'm raising many complex issues. I realize that there's no simple answers, but I wanted to just share with you some of my thinking about how these issues about replicability and whether they even make sense, and the importance of defining the sample in terms of the research you do. So I'm sorry again that I can't be with you. Best wishes on your conference.